Welcome back to those of you who've been with us during portions of this week or all of this week. I see some familiar faces out there, so again, welcome back. For those of you who are new to us today, I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia and a registered 501c3. Also like to thank our members and partners for supporting us. Without your support, these programs would not be possible. If you're not a member, please consider joining us. This morning, we'll continue our discussions on political warfare in East Asia. Today, we're pivoting, though, to look at advanced democracies, for instance, the US and Australia, and how political warfare plays out in and against these countries. Our guests this morning are Clarke and Matthew Sussex, and our host, our moderator this morning, as has been all week, is Jacques deLisle, who is our program director of FPRI's Asia program. He is also the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, and director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a prolific author. His articles have appeared in numerous scholarly journals. He also most recently wrote a book, To Get Rich is Glorious, Challenges Facing China's Economic Reform and Opening at 40, which he co-edited with Avery Goldstein. And his next book, Taiwan Under Tsai, is coming out later this year and is co-edited with June Teufel-Dreyer, whom you will all remember if you were on our call yesterday. Jacques received his JD in graduate education in political science at Harvard. And a few housekeeping matters. If you want to ask a question, go down to the bottom of your screen and click chat, which will pull up a box on the right of your screen where you can put your questions in. I'll let Jacques explain, but our program this morning is a little different because most of it has been pre-recorded last night because our guest scholars this morning are from Australia. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jacques.
Well, thank you very much, Raleigh, and thank you all for joining us. As Raleigh just said, because our authors are based in Australia, we didn't want to make them stay up until 2 in the morning for the session, so we pre-recorded our discussion. We will be doing live Q&A at the end. They have an article on the issue, I have an article on the issue as well, which covers some of the same ground from slightly different perspectives, so I think I can at least attempt to wield questions you might, field questions you might raise to them. So this is our fourth and final installment in a series on political warfare in and from East Asia. In this case, it's from East Asia to Anglophone advanced democracies, if you will, primarily the US and Australia, as Raleigh said in this discussion. And I think, as you'll see in the recorded part of the session, this really is very much a discussion of political warfare as conventionally defined. Again, for those who've been with us, you've heard some of these definitions before, but I think as you listen to this, you will hear lots of examples of what one leading definition of political warfare says it's all about, which is the overt and covert use of a wide range of tools, diplomatic, political, economic, and informational, to affect the policy decision-making and the political context of policy decision-making in targeted countries. Or if you prefer sharp power, the idea of perforating, penetrating, or piercing the political media and social environments of other countries. That's what a lot of this discussion is about. So I hope you'll enjoy the back and forth that I had with Matthew Sussex and Michael Clarke last evening, and we'll be back for Q&A. Let me just give you a little bit about the authors. Michael Clarke is Associate Professor at the National Security College at the Australian National University and Director of the ANU Indiana University Pan-Asia Institute. He's written widely on contemporary China and its engagement with the world, including Xinjiang and China's rise in Central Asia. And also written on Australian foreign policy issues. Jennifer Hunt, one of his co-authors, is a lecturer in the National Security College at ANU and a research associate of its US Studies Center. And Matthew Sussex, whom you'll also see on the tape, Jennifer wasn't able to join us, but Matthew Sussex is associate professor also at the National Security College of ANU, where he's written on conflict in the former USSR, violence and the state, and power politics and confrontation in Eurasia. Obviously a group that's well suited to address this. And without further ado, I think we can roll the tape from last night's discussion. And I'll be back after that.
In the article you write with Matthew and Jennifer that's in this special issue of Orbis on political warfare, one of the things you start out grappling with is really almost a definitional problem. Partly it's a conceptual one, but it's also got some, I think, real implications for how we evaluate the politics of this, which is a difference between influence, which is hard to be 100% against, and interference, which is clearly a more pejorative term. So can you say what you guys mean by that and what falls in which bucket when we're talking about China's efforts targeting advanced industrial democracies like the United States and Australia?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of, this is the central sort of starting point, is to try and tease out the differences between influence and interference. I suppose, to cut a long story short, the way in which we conceptualise the difference is essentially one here of saying, okay, well, influence is often unwelcome in various forms, but is often not illegal. So, for instance, the way in which Chinese entities or Chinese-linked entities have attempted to seek leverage with elected representatives, for instance, whether individually or via various lobbying activities, funding of political parties, these kind of things. In both situations, until quite recently, certainly in Australia, that wasn't illegal. Obviously, there's been the recent foreign interference legislation that has attempted to grapple with some of those issues, yet there's still a lot of grey area around that. Interference, on the other hand, I think we delineate as essentially covert and coercive activities, which are in fact often illegal. So, for instance, there are various elements of China's activities recently in Australia and in the US that fall into that interference category. Various cyber hacks of various institutions or entities. In the Australian case, we've had a number over the last few years. Most recently, the hack of the Australian Parliament that was attributed by ASIO to the Ministry of State Security in Beijing. So those activities clearly fall within interference, a clear abrogation of Australian sovereignty.
I might just jump in there if I can as well, just to put some more meat on the bones. I guess the question that a lot of people are grappling with is where do you draw the legal line between interference and influence? And I guess while we certainly do make that case that conventionally we understand that somewhere there is a dividing line between what is interference and what is influence based on the laws of a particular country. As we know, of course, that's getting really increasingly difficult to sort of judge. And I think perhaps one of the things that we add to this is to say, well, interference is probably more based on whether or not you get direct access to political actors and are able to put pressure on them to change their decision making. So whereas, for instance, you might want to, as a sort of hostile state, might want to boost a certain political candidate by appealing to the electorate. You might engage in all sorts of information operations to try and persuade publics that a particular political actor is good or bad. It gets more tricky, I think, when you're actually in the business of then giving direct donations or doing so in a kind of under the table way. To either political parties or political actors. And one of the good examples of that is the donation of $100,000 in cash in a shopping bag to the New South Wales branch of the Australian Labor Party by one of China's most prominent donors, subsequently blocked from giving money to political parties. Now, I mean, in our view, that is kind of interference. Even if, under the laws of the day, it might skirt the boundaries of what is legal. So lawfare, grey zone kind of operations like these are things that we're going to just experience more and more of. And I think it's also worth noting that actors like China and also Russia and other actors are kind of well aware of the legal space in which they play. And I think they're quite adept at sort of skirting that to sort of increase the deniability of their actions, but also to ensure that the things that they do fall into those kind of grey spaces.
So in Australia, you've had, as you say, actual money going to politicians. The US has had some brief glimpse of that. There was a bundler back in the 90s, Johnny Chung, I think was the name, who gave money to the Clinton campaign. We don't seem to have had quite that level. Could you say, for people who may not be so familiar with the Australian case, how far that has gone in things that are clearly over the line into interference? You mentioned the briefcase full of cash, or the satchel full of cash, but there's also been questions of certainly in your general part of the world, New Zealand's been part of this mix as well, right? Where you've had members of the government, members of parliament who are problematically connected to China and sort of a conduit for influence. Could you speak to those issues a little bit?
Sure, mate. Yeah, sure. I mean, the obvious one is Sam Dastyari, which we mentioned in the paper as well, former Labor Party federal senator. The issue for Dastyari was acceptance of Chinese money to pay off, I think it was $10,000 worth of debt or something that had been incurred potentially from his campaign for the Senate. And the question then was the linkage between that and some of his statements, which seemed to contravene Labor Party policy on a range of China-related issues, such as the South China Sea, for instance. So it's sort of this line of sort of targeting perhaps particular elected officials for particular forms of influence, if not interference, as a way of massaging or at least putting a gap between their views and the views of the government of the day or the particular political party that they happen to find themselves in. I think the other interesting question as well that we also touch upon later on in the paper is more to do with former government ministers or MPs who then, lo and behold, find themselves, with very well-paid consultancies with either Chinese companies or Chinese-linked organisations. So one example is the former Trade Minister Andrew Robb, who has been connected to Landbridge, and there was much controversy in Australia a few years ago about the lease of the Port of Darwin to Landbridge and Andrew Robb's role in that. So there are a number of issues there around former or ex government ministers, MPs, being if not targeted, then certainly becoming involved with Chinese-linked entities. So that's another issue, I think, as well, that spurred some of the foreign interference legislation. If you look at the fine print of that, there is parts therein that suggest that these kind of activities now have to be directly declared under legislation. They have to be registered as agents of a foreign actor. So there is an attempt, at least, to sort of grapple with this issue.
And also one of the more interesting stories that came out in our most recent federal election was a candidate who was subsequently elected, and she was basically on the governing party's side, called Gladys Liu, and she had extensive ties to Chinese business organisations and was renowned for her ability to fundraise amongst Chinese communities. The question came when, she started putting up ads, political ads at polling booths in exactly the same font and exactly the same colour that was used by the official Australian Electoral Commission, and with instructions in Mandarin saying the correct way to vote is for the Liberal Party. Now this made just to show how pernicious this can be. When she was elected, she subsequently remembered that she had been the head of or a member of a number of Chinese Australia Friendship Societies, when previously she hadn't declared that. But more than that, it prompted the government to enter into a kind of dual standards type argument, whereas it had castigated the opposition for having Chinese Australians as sort of part of their networks and having too many ties to them. When it came to Gladys Liu, because she was on the government side, all of a sudden that was racist to attack her. So it just shows how I think domestic political cohesion can potentially be undermined as well by these types of activities.
It's become an incredibly fraught issue in the United States, of course, as well. We haven't had quite as many prominent people of Chinese ethnicity in political positions, but it's been ramped up with COVID now. This sort of it's taken this racial quality, and becomes very difficult to disentangle what are perfectly innocent connections with those that are suspicious. And as I'm sure you're having at your universities here in the US, there's this huge issue about students and scholars coming over from Chinese institutions who may run the gamut from being genuine colleagues who would be the same as one would find anywhere, versus people who are essentially sent out by the government. So how much is that? So we were talking some about the methods of influence. One is essentially buying access to people who wield governmental or political power. Another is cultivating or cultivating the interest or cultivating the careers of those who might be in a position to advance China's agenda. But there are other tools in the toolkit as well. Some of these would look a bit like United Front organizations, and some quite literally are United Front organizations. I wonder if you could speak to what else is in the toolkit that has been of concern in Australia and that you've seen going on in the United States, since your article does address both.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the obvious one is the Confucius Institutes, and that's obviously been an issue in the United States as well. Certainly in this country, it's not just the Confucius Institutes, it's also the question of linkages between Australian universities and various higher education institutions in China as well, and issues around how close some of these institutions may be to various elements of the Chinese Communist Party, certainly connected to PLA universities, for instance, or Ministry of State Security, and there's questions there about, I suppose, the probity of a range of research linkages, particularly in the hard sciences, it seems, around particular dual-use technologies as well, that could possibly be used. So there's quite a bit of controversy there. I think these issues, again, play into that bigger bucket of influence issues. And to me, at least, and Matt might have a view on this, that this sort of distinguishes the Chinese case from the Russian case in particular, is that the Chinese do engage in interference, as we've seen, but the longer game, in a sense, is influence. So it's really more about shaping attitudes, shaping opinions of particular target countries to the Chinese state. And this, of course, takes time. So it's about cultivating particular linkages, cultivating particular narratives as well about China. And this is, of course, where the China friendship associations as well come into it as well. I think it's about shaping public opinion about the nature of the Chinese state, also about particular issues. So, for instance, about the Belt and Road Initiative as well, some of the positive messaging around that, issues to do about focusing on the economic aspects rather than geopolitical, focusing on the way in which Belt and Road is supposedly fostering win-win, so-called win-win relationships, interconnectivity and so on. And of course, obviously that's taken a hit in recent times, but it had been quite effective. So I think there's a continuum in the Chinese case in terms of different elements of influence activities, ranging from those very targeted ones around specific individuals, right through to much broader ones that are focused on long-term massaging, if you will, of perceptions of China.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of changed relatively recently, particularly concerning the sort of influence at universities, as well as research and potential dual-use applications of research products, especially when it comes to the health sector, especially when it comes to AI and surveillance technology. And this is something we've seen in Australia and the United States. I think it's interesting that in the US context in particular, a lot of the way that Chinese influence was characterized was typically around espionage, right? The stealing of secrets, intellectual property, and so forth. Now, I think this is perhaps why, Australia is almost a canary in the coal mine for the US example. The US case is that we started to see earlier on, I think, an increase in Chinese PhD students who were sponsored by the PLA coming out here to do various projects that then might have, potential military applications or social control applications when it came to tech and data and so forth. And I think now the United States is starting to experience that. And that's why there's been, interestingly enough, the big debate over the recent few weeks in the US about the extent of Chinese influence and, whether Chinese PhD students belong on US campuses and whether they should be, kicked out. Michael's right in that it's almost as though Chinese strategy has become more sophisticated in that, initially it's around, okay, let's try and harvest the IP, to one with, okay, let's get the IP, but let's do it in this, in partnership with universities and tertiary institutions and other research institutes, which makes it more legitimate. And therefore it's a struggle for both, lawmaking entities in Australia and in the United States to try and combat that type of activity, because it'll also be branded by the PRC when you do take those steps as racist. You're fundamentally exclusionary against one ethnic group. Why are you doing this to the Chinese and you're not doing it to, say, the Indians or, the British or the Germans and so forth? And this is why I think it does demonstrate a sort of more sophistication on the part of Beijing vis-a-vis Russia, which is the normal comparator, because, China has very much a stake in moulding the order to suit its preferences, whereas Russia, frankly, just wants to tear everything down. Whereas Russia is, fundamentally a hostile negative actor, Beijing wants to play within the rules and then shift the rules gradually towards its preferences.
I think those last comments take us a bit from methods into goals, but I want to loop back to a piece which we want to turn to next. I want to deal with one more piece of the method story. So Michael mentioned the Confucius Institutes, and Matthew's just discussed the STEM scholars. And in the United States, there's been quite a trajectory, as you noted there. The Confucius Institutes first came in and were pretty much welcomed because they largely targeted poorly resourced schools way down the pecking order, that would not be able to teach Chinese, which is obviously the high demand language. And this is mostly language instruction. Then they worked their way up the chain to where they were getting Ivy League and top tier state universities setting them up. And those places, of course, didn't need the Chinese language instruction, so they often wound up getting into areas which had more content type issues. And so we started to hear you can't talk about Tibet, or there's an objection to delving into the Xinjiang issues. And the bloom really came off the rose to the point where a fair number of them have been shut down. There's much more about the Hanban's role. And you were just mentioning the difference between how one approaches, say, German investment versus Chinese investment. Well, it's the same thing with the institutes. They're portrayed, as you say, to be kind of in the normal rules, as if they were the Alliance Française or the something that the Japan Education Ministry put out, but clearly they're much more ambiguous at best. And on the student side, we've gotten into the U.S. and we're going to turn into responses in a bit in terms of how we've had a sort of polarized or not polarized response in various places. But one area where the U.S. has gotten kind of polarized is universities which are upholding free exchange of information, getting the best and the brightest from around the world and all that, colliding with the Justice Department and others who are very concerned about technology leakage, infiltration, turning people and so on. And each side distrusts the other, right? The government sees the university is hopelessly naive or perhaps hotbeds of left-wing squishiness. And the universities see the Justice Department as enacting Stephen Miller's anti-immigration agenda and paranoid about China. So I know we'll get to this a little bit in the Australian context in terms of the broader response. But on the university side, has it been polarizing there the way it has been here?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, look, I actually read a piece a couple of years ago saying that the Australian debate on China is getting really dangerously polarised. We've basically become prisoners of our own polarisation. And unfortunately, I think it's produced some really unhelpful dialogue. It demonstrates that, I think in the Australian context, there's no real consensus about China and Belt and Road. and really no consensus about Australia's national interest in respect to how you navigate the relationship with the United States, especially under the Trump administration, but also with Xi Jinping and a more assertive China, particularly in the sort of, well, assertive and also wounded in the post-COVID era. So, as we know, when there are divisions in discourses on foreign and security policy, that can be a really healthy thing. It can promote learning, it can promote exchange, and so forth. In Australia, I'd argue that it is now become a dialogue of the deaf, where you have, and particularly within universities, but also influenced by government and think tanks, where you'd have one group that is essentially the China hawks, and another group that's the panda huggers. And they operate in silos. They don't talk to one another because instantly they tend to dismiss the other's approach. That's when polarization in discourses and lack of consensus becomes problematic. And I think we've got a way to go before we step our way out of that. And of course, there's different circumstances here in that Australia has its main trade partner and its main security ally as two countries that are gearing up for confrontation in its backyard. and so this makes the notion of choice or the notion of nuance within choices particularly vexed and particularly difficult. I think within the United States, and Michael can speak more to this because he knows much more about it, where you've had internal narratives about China, that's been hardening, at least in government circles, more or less in a bipartisan fashion. It's certainly obviously that the Republicans have been more muscular and more assertive, but not always. Hillary Clinton was particularly vocal on China, for instance. Whereas there is discord, I think, on what to do with China in the United States, particularly within tertiary institutions now and the centre, I think there's more harmony than you find in Australia. But Michael might have other views.
Yeah, Michael, so the article goes into this, and I'd love to hear your sort of synopsis of that. But I think it is fair to say that at this point, the panda huggers are largely in whatever hole Saddam Hussein was hiding, at least in policy circles, and the dragon slayers are out there in both parties. The question is who can be more aggressively trying to drive the panda to extinction. So let me turn it to Michael to talk about what he sees as the differences in the politics of dealing with Chinese influence in Australia and the United States.
Yeah, well, I think so. To take off where Matt left off there in terms of the US context, I mean, I think it's interesting that you have this bipartisan position now in the United States where both Republicans and Democrats, I think, generally recognise or perceive China to be, if not a direct threat, then certainly, in the language of the Trump administration's national security strategy, as a strategic competitor. So I think that's kind of the baseline consensus position in the United States now, and some of the rhetoric in the Democratic primaries, pre-COVID, suggested, in fact, a very hardline position within the Democratic Party as well. You had Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren basically linking, corruption and kleptocracy, as they called it, internally, with manifestations of that internationally, of which China and Russia were two targets, really. You also have Joe Biden, taking a much stronger position. I think we quoted him in towards the latter sections of the paper, where he was quite strong and saying, not just about IP theft, about issues around China not abiding by the spirit of WTO regulations with international trade, but also calling out China for having concentration camps for Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for instance. So very, very strong language, which suggests that, even if, regardless of whoever is elected in November this year, you will still have a continuation of a hardline position in the United States. I think in the Australian case, you have a bigger problem in the sense that there is a claim by some of perhaps more of the hawkish voices on China that there is a consensus, that we share the American position. I actually don't think that is the case. If you actually look at more of the alternate voices in the China debate, there is actually much more debate, in fact, about what, in fact, the level and intensity of threat that China poses to Australia than the hawks would have people believe, I think. And I think this is part of the issue around the particular toxicity of the Australian debate at the moment is you have particular voices in the Australian debate who have very good access politically, but also very good profiles in terms of media, opinion pieces and so on, who very much pushing the strong hawkish line, basically to the exclusion of other views. And as Matt suggested, this is not necessarily a good thing for Australian national security. There actually does need to be a fairly clear and honest debate about the various choices that confront Australia. And the problem with the current debate is that it's closing off choices rather than opening them up.
So a lot of stuff to explore there about how both countries have responded, and I do want to turn to that before we're out of time. But before that, I want to look back to some things at the end of one of Matthew's earlier comments, which is what the goals are. What is China's end here? Obviously, there's a tactical story you've been telling about trying to influence politicians and trying to influence the politics around politicians that then influences how they take positions on issues of interest to China. But if you were to sort of inventory what China is up to, what is the purpose of these tools of this political warfare? We've alluded a couple of times to what sound like almost grand strategy attempts to remake international norms, but presumably there's a spectrum at which that's at the far end of this. If you could just say a little bit about how you read the purposes, the ends to which China is using these methods.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one sort of major part of the paper we talk about China's influence and interference operations, and the subheading is securing the party and the China dream. And I think that kind of gets to the core elements, I think, of the main objectives of China's influence and interference operations. On the one hand, and this has all been very, very well documented elsewhere, is the way in which the party has attempted to use various forms of technological innovation and so on to enhance its security at home, social credit system, social management, these kind of things. But the flip side to that internationally, I think, is really this issue of those longer term objectives about shaping particular narratives about China, but also about shaping institutions, norms and standards. And I think this is where Belt and Road is interesting. Nadij, Roland has talked about this extensively, is the way in which various institutions, bodies, multilateral forums that are encompassed by Belt and Road are really about bedding down Chinese normative interests, but also attempting to legitimise them and making them appear, in a sense, as being as a legitimate alternative to Western-led or Western-authored multilateral institutions and norms. So it's really, there's obviously a geopolitical goal that underlies this, but the actual mode by which it is pursued, I think, is much more indirect, certainly than I think many would normally expect in terms of great power competition. Normally great power competition, people think of arms racing, traditional security dilemmas and these kind of things, whereas China has adopted, for a variety of reasons, a much more indirect approach, which in some senses actually makes it much more powerful, I think.
Matthew, do you want to weigh in on that topic?
Yeah. In terms of just a couple of points to add, I was going to, not really say anything because Michael summed it up pretty perfectly. But just a couple of things to add that Australia is a very useful test case for Beijing, I think, given its relative position sort of between China and the United States. And I think, the thinking in Beijing is, well, let's just see how far Australia can potentially be pushed in terms of its economic interests. And in a post-COVID era, that it becomes particularly acute in an Australian context because we're a liberal maritime trading state. We want to see, effectively free and open trade. But paradoxically, it's China that's sort of promoting those norms rather than the United States. And yet China is promoting those norms within the BRI context fundamentally bilaterally rather than multilaterally. It sort of looks multilateral, but ultimately these are deals done between individual states and China. And if you wanted to disrupt a broad rules-based order, that's the absolute ideal way to go about it, because you get to split countries off and you get to do preferential deals, and you basically contribute to a massive, well, not just the noodle bowl of preferential trading agreements that already exists within the Asia-Pacific space, but you even add to that noodle bowl, so the noodles overflow, given that there's loads of bilateral BRI deals done with the Chinese. So Australia in that context is really useful. I think also in a broader economic sense, a lot of the debate now has started to revolve around decoupling. Is China trustworthy? Is it, and regardless of whether it's trustworthy or not, is it sensible to be so dependent in terms of global supply chains on the PRC? Now, on the one hand, I think certainly we will see some decoupling, and that the Chinese efforts in this space will not be entirely successful, and you'll see new hubs and nodes for global supply crop up. But then the Chinese argument, on the other hand, and probably the Chinese strategy in this respect, and this is something that they will push very much in terms of their domestic influence campaigns, is, well, we have the supply chain that already exists. Two, are you going to onshore and bring everything home and restart cottage industries? If so, that's going to be very expensive. And three, precisely, where are you going to recouple? So they would use essentially market language, paradoxically, for a communist nation. They would use the language of the market and the incentives of the market-based structure to try and stymie attempts by countries like Australia, by the United States, by others, to reprioritise or diversify where they get not just strategic assets, but pretty much anything. In the COVID era, any commodity now potentially becomes a strategic asset if it's under threat.
Okay, terrific. So that gets us a bit into the responses, but before we turn to that, I just want to add a little bit to what I see, at least in the US case, as being the ends to which China has been deploying these means. So some of it is, as Steve alluded to a bit, to blunt the expression of certain viewpoints on certain issues that China is sensitive about. So, the Hong Kong issue, we had the famous issue with the Houston Rockets tweet and the NBA and all that, and the websites for U.S. airlines and hotels, which covers Hong Kong as well as Taiwan. So keeping that one China narrative in place, blunting the critique of Xinjiang as well. You can go through the whole list, not wanting Tibet to overshadow the Olympics back in 2008. So there are attempts to either influence public opinion or influence political influencers not to articulate certain positions. That's fairly fine-grained case-by-case stuff. Then there is, I think, what you're pointing to, which is an agenda of destabilizing international norms that are not suited to China's interests or its preferences. So far, I think it's hard to discern what the affirmative agenda is other than making the world safe for autocracy. But clearly it is chafing against some of those existing rules. And frankly, I think the US has made it easy because by backing away from support for those institutions, we've given China an option. They can, as Matthew points out, talk the talk of supporting international norms and institutions without really being called out on what it actually means and how status quo it is. And you can set up new institutions like the AIIB or the RCEP, all the alphabet soup of arrangements that have the right language in them, but that don't really seem to walk the walk that would go with that talk. And it is a funny world where Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang can show up at Davos as the protectors of globalization. That's the world we now live in. So I want to throw it back to Michael. He can add to that set of issues if he wants. But I also want to get into something that Matthew went into in his last answer, which is how should countries like the US and Australia respond, and how well have we been doing in responding to the kinds of challenges that we've been discussing the last half hour or so? Michael?
Yeah, I just might quickly add just to the last point you made there about, can we see any sort of positive agenda here? I mean, I think there certainly is that element of whittling away or weakening the existing elements of the order that Beijing doesn't find conducive to its interests. But I think what's been interesting under Xi Jinping is you do have, in a certain way, a positive agenda And this is something that William Callaghan from London School of Economics has talked about a great deal, and I think quite insightfully so. And he suggests that this is really about, there's a geopolitical narrative for Belt and Road and the so-called Great National Rejuvenation of China, but there is also a moral imperative in the way in which Xi Jinping and others speak about this, is that you can now have Chinese principles of socioeconomic order that can now be deployed globally, in a sense. So if you think about, the various boilerplate phrases about the community of common destiny, for instance, a way of presenting Chinese, or the way in which the party has phrased them anyway, as Chinese civilizational understandings, for instance, can now become global products, if you will, a means of shaping global norms, institutions. So I think there is a positive element that is there, but it's certainly one that certainly at the current time, after COVID, seems to have limited purchase, I would argue. In terms of the issue of how the United States and Australia have done in responding, I mean, I think we've touched on, and Matt's touched upon a few of these issues in the Australian context. I mean, one of the problems, again, in the Australian context, is the nature of the debate itself, which I think makes it very difficult for governments, federal and at the state level, to really grapple with these issues without becoming extremely politicised. Various charges of racism being thrown around, charges of being lackeys of the United States, for instance, as well. I mean, some very hoary old tropes that tend to get thrown about. So it makes it very difficult. Even the foreign interference legislation that was passed a number of years ago is interesting in the sense of thinking about, what are the actual teeth of the legislation itself, and that actually doesn't seem to be much in that regard. I mean, there is an open register for individuals, organisations to register themselves as foreign agents. Various institutions, individuals have done so, but the question then becomes, well, so what now? What will be done with this information? I think that's a little bit of a hole in the Australian response. The other hole is of course, in a sort of grand strategic sense, and this goes back to this issue of a lack of consensus about China. In contrast to the United States, where you have a sort of settled position that China is a strategic competitor. That is not the case in Australia, which leaves, I think, Australian strategic policy in a little bit of limbo around that issue of how do you balance between China and the United States, given that China is increasingly, or seen as being increasingly assertive, belligerent in some senses, but so is the United States. How do you manage those sets of relationships with Australia's own interests forefront of mind? And I think there is no clear narrative about how we do that. And I think, again, that contrasts reasonably well with the US case, where you have obviously various idiosyncrasies, shall we say, of the Trump administration. Yet if you sort of dig down to, the Department of Defense, the State Department, there are career officials there who have, I would say, fairly clear and strong views about what the US approach, in a very broad sense, should be to China. And in a sense, that gives a little bit more continuity than in the Australian context.
Yeah, I think go ahead.
Yeah, look, I'll just be very quick in terms of, how we're doing and what we should do. It just depends on what the objective is for both the United States and Australia in terms of China. If in Australia the objective is continue to hedge and balance and to wait and see, then I think the answer is that Australia's done reasonably, but effectively what it's done is kick the can down the road to see what happens after November, frankly. And I think that's where Australian elites are looking to get a sense of what our position will be in future. Good example, in addition to the one Michael raised, something called UFIT, which is the University Foreign Interference Task Force, which is supposed to monitor or get universities to self-monitor potential national interest violations when it comes to foreign interference. Doesn't mention China, but it's certainly aimed at it. Now, this is self-regulation, entirely voluntary, and so it looks good on paper, but it depends whether the universities will actually follow that, given that the predominant incentive they have is to continue to develop research with China, because they worry that federal funding has been drying up over a series of decades. If on the sort of strategic level, just to turn to the US, if the objective is to constrain China, then I think on the military security side they're doing fairly well. On the sort of economic side and the normative side, less well, because we have had, as you mentioned, the undermining of norms, order, and so forth in terms of free trade agendas. But more than that, it doesn't seem to be as much cash on the American side when it comes to aid. And the Pacific is a good example of this. So we have, for instance, the Blue Dot Network, which is a certification scheme, a Michelin star guide, basically, for good investment partners, but really isn't backed with a large amount of money. Whereas the PRC, in terms of the cash it's been prepared to splash, in the Pacific, will do all sorts of things like build stadiums and house data warehouses and provide 5G streaming video to Pacific communities. And this is something that sort of taps into the base desires of people who live there. So in that respect, I think the US is effectively playing catch up, and it needs to catch up quickly.
I think in terms of the outward-facing side of it, the U.S. is not really fully competing in this, and people point to the BUILD Act as a counter to the BRI, but it's infinitesimal. And what had been a U.S. advantage, the soft power side, has been significantly squandered in recent years. So the question is, what's the pathway forward? And to say on the U.S. side, I share your views completely about the broad consensus about taking a more negative view on China, but I think some of the hard details really are contentious still. The debate over decoupling is really, I think, just getting going, and there's not a very serious assessment yet of the costs and feasibility of that and how much we're willing to pay. I mean, you're beating up on Huawei, but that only gets you so far down that path. So we're just about out of time here, but I wanted to give you both a chance to weigh in briefly on something we touched upon a couple of times in our discussion, but I know our audience is interested, which is, just in a few sentences, how does COVID-19, again, you touched on earlier, but anything we haven't said so far, how does COVID-19 change the story that you tell in the article and that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes or so?
Look, I'll give Michael the majority of the sentences, and I'll just say one. It makes all of this much more acute and much more urgent.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I mean, I think we've seen an example of that recently in Australia, where you may have seen this in the US as well, the so-called dossier of issues around COVID, of essentially saying that apparently released by the State Department, saying that there was the source of coronavirus was in fact man-made and so on, and then the subsequent revelation that this in fact wasn't really essentially an intelligence-based dossier. Yet that was paraded around by a number of media outlets in this country as being essentially an authentic representation of US intelligence views. And Trump. Sorry?
Five Eyes.
And Five Eyes, yes. Yeah, it is being as legitimate. And sort of again, and having this very quickly retracted, it again throws into this mix of degrappling with Chinese influence operations, for instance, in information warfare, as you now have this other element, is that you now have disinformation in some ways coming from, it seems, Australia's alliance partner or partners, which is also a troubling scenario, I would argue, which again goes to Matt's point, is that this makes it much more difficult for governments to grapple with this problem. And on the Chinese side, of course, you've seen a ramping up on their side of disinformation as well around COVID, about attempting to deflect blame in a variety of ways, blaming the US military for releasing COVID allegedly in Wuhan and so on, these very outlandish theories. So in a way, you've kind of got this competition of outlandish disinformation operations going on with states like Australia, who are close allies of the United States, sort of sandwiched in the middle of these, which it just increases the difficulty.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Michael Clarke and Matthew Sussex, and in absentia Jennifer Hunt, the third author of this article. I commend the piece to anyone who's listening. It's really a terrific treatment of the issues we've been talking about. And now, because if they were live, would be in the wee hours of the morning in Australia, we're going to say goodbye to Michael and Matthew, and I will do my best to field questions from the audience in the spirit in which I would think they would answer them. So forgive me if I don't get it right, but thank you for joining us today, and see you soon.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
Jacques.
you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We'll just be 1 minute as Jacques comes back online.
Okay.
Jacques, you're there.
Yeah. Okay, I'm here. All right. Do we have anything in the chat box, or how are we doing this?
We have a lot.
I'm unfortunately not seeing it. I think it's it could be a glitch because I wasn't logged on a moment ago. Do you want to read me some questions? Do it that way.
We have a question from Ira Strauss. Robert Strauss, who pays two main concerns when forming FPRI. One, to defeat the pressures and political warfare of the USSR, and two, to unify the West more deeply as the core of the world order. Using the Soviet threat as a foil for this positive goal are directly applicable to this discussion. Thanks to FPRI for the series on Concern 1. What about Concern 2? How can we, during this conflict, add to and deepen the arrangements for unity with our allies across the Atlantic and Pacific?
Terrific question. One of the things I think we got into in the video discussion, and certainly in the articles, is this sort of China-Russia comparison. And the view that Michael and Matthew and Jennifer have in their article is that in some ways China is actually a little more insidious than what the Soviet Union was back in the old days, or that Russia is today. Certainly Russia today what was more the comparison. And then their view is that that is basically a disruptive force, that Russia is out to sort of undermine institutions the US has built in that agenda, and that China may have a more proactive agenda to reshape a world order more to its liking. Now, I think I disagree a little bit with Michael and his co-authors there. I think the Chinese position is a little more inchoate. I think its positive agendas a lot vaguer at this point. But to the extent you think the analogy works, then the tools translate. And there's a reason that Kennan gets quoted as much as he does, the author of the famous Mr. X article, in the discussions of political warfare. So it's a question about the nature of the threat. I actually think that the Chinese toolkit looks much more like the Russian toolkit if you look at where it has been used in China's nearer abroad, things that China has done to try to influence politics in Hong Kong and very much in Taiwan as well, have some very Russian-like features, sowing disinformation, sowing polarization, the sort of thing we saw in Russia targeting the US 2016 elections. One of the things that I think you're right to ask is very much on the table is this question of how the West and its allies can unite. I think that's sort of a good news, bad news story. The good news is that there is a growing realization of the nature and the threats posed through the kind of political warfare tactics that China employs. One of the arguments from Clarke and his co-authors is that Australia is sort of divided on how to assess this, and the US is more united in seeing this as a problem from China. I tend to think I'm a little more pessimistic about whether the US is on the same page about what to do about a more negative assessment of China. So I think the first step is to have internal consensus in these countries about how to deal with it. The next step is international cooperation. And there we're in a bad moment. On so many fronts, the US has, in the last few years especially, been not very good about tending to those kinds of relationships. And so the current problem we face is that there's not a lot of coordination. There is some parallel concerns and sets of critiques and talk about responses, but it's not really been coordinated. Now, coordination is obviously necessary and useful in things like imposing sanctions or pursuing sort of discrete policy remedies. A little harder to do in the shadowy world of political warfare, but it certainly doesn't help if you are not in good shape in general with your relationships with a lot of the countries that share your concerns and your values. I think the first thing to do is to try to repair that kind of relationship, and the second thing to do is to have some serious nitty-gritty discussions about what exactly the challenges and threats are, and what's the priority in dealing with them.
Thanks, Jacques. The next question is from Mario Riccardi. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. The difference between interference and influence, is this only a matter of legal status?
Interesting question. It's another one where I think there's a little bit of distance between where Clarke and his co-authors go and where I go on this. I mean, I think that it does not neatly track legal distinctions. That is a conceptual distinction, and here I agree with him, is that there is a difference between things which are clearly above board and acceptable, trying to get your views known, trying to state policy positions, trying to persuade, and things that are clearly not okay, delivering sacks of cash to politicians, and some of the covert operations, hacking and things like that. And then there's sort of a gray zone in between. Law counts for some of that, but I don't think you can bootstrap your way into declaring something truly malicious interference simply by passing a law against it, especially if your laws are not much constrained by a sense of what the real threat is. And if you look at the debates about how to respond to the Chinese role, which has been a partisan debate in Australia and is less clearly on partisan lines in the US, is this tendency to reach pretty far in trying to strike back against China in ways that just don't resonate as dealing with legitimate concerns. And so you then get into this meta debate about, is this a legitimate use of the law? So something like Huawei providing the infrastructure for broadband, 4G, 5G type networks, does that cross the line into being political rather than security? Or something like scrutinizing Chinese investments, some of which look like they're getting into dual use areas and sensitive companies, and some of which just, movie theaters, why bother? So I think it's an ambiguous relationship, but I think the legal responses are more politically legitimate and probably more effective as policy if they are informed by principles about what a genuine threat is, rather than simply trying to stuff everything, anti-China you can into a bill.
So our next question is from Dan Lieberman. He asks, are there other organizations and entities allied with polices of foreign governments which operate similarly to those mentioned for the Chinese, specifically asking about the US, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, and that those countries have also criticized? Is the Chinese attempts to influence minor compared to the activities of other governments?
Well, I'm not going to purport to be an expert on what most places other than China are doing. I will say that two things. One is that I think it's pretty widely agreed among people who study the political warfare phenomenon and kind of almost cultural diplomacy more broadly, that there is a difference between things like the Alliance Française or the Goethe Institute and the Confucius Institute. I mean, there's a question about whether they're sort of more diffusely spreading culture and goodwill about the outbound country, or whether they are engaged in something which has a much more sharp-edged political agenda and that is much more directed by the government. And I will say that the ambiguity or the uncertainty that you point to is something that China has very much pushed back on. And so the Chinese view is, hey, all we're doing is what you're doing to us. So there's a lot of discourse on the Chinese side about how the United States, through a variety of mechanisms, has tried to influence politics and policy in China, whether it be the Peace Corps or whether it be democracy promotion programs, or there's sort of a long list. And it doesn't take a whole lot of work to cherry pick statements about how varying ways of engaging China, getting into the WTO, establishing more contacts, are going to change China into a more liberal democratic place. So at least the rhetoric of this from the Chinese side has been, all we're doing to you is what you've been trying to do to us. The Chinese phrase translates as peaceful evolution. In Chinese political lexicon, that's a transitive verb. You are trying peacefully to evolve us into something more to your liking. You see it in the Hong Kong context as well, where during the height of the protests last year, the allegations, and they're being repeated somewhat now with the discussion of the national security law in Hong Kong, the allegation was that the US and other outside forces are behind this attempt to subvert and pursue regime change in China, which is even more radical, obviously, than merely trying to influence one's foreign policy. You know, overblown, but not completely unfounded as a sense of a US agenda to try to promote certain values inside China.
So we have two questions left, and we're kind of running up against the end of our time, so I'll put them both together. A senior fellow of FPRI, June Dreyer, asked, to what extent have the more subtle aspects of Chinese diplomacy that the speakers mentioned been harmed by recent aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy? And on a somewhat similar note, Andre Stein asked, how has the Australian national security architecture changed to combat Chinese influence and interference?
Okay, you'd have to get Michael and company to answer the second question. What I know from some conversations with them is that there have been attempts to do a bit more coordination, the kind of whole of government thing, but I really can't speak to the details. In terms of whether the tools China has been using have become less effective because they are mixed with this wolf warrior diplomacy, and I would say also mixed with what has not been an entirely successful effort to portray the way China has handled COVID, yeah, I think it hurts. You know, in my piece in Orbis, the front part of it tries to assess why China has turned so much to political warfare and sharp power. And I think the answer is that the other two big tools in the toolkit aren't terribly useful. Hard power and military coercion is too costly to use. It produces pushback and drives alliances against you. And it tends to lead to responsive investment and measures, and gets the world kind of aligned against you. Soft power, China has had something of a soft power outage. It's definitely been in decline the last several years. There's an attempt to rehabilitate it, but mostly targeting often not terribly democratic countries in the developing world. And so the more China flexes its muscles, tries to push countries around, gets sort of dismissive, I think the less effective some of these things are. And you can see this, I think, in the downward trend in US-China relations, where now the view is almost everything from China is suspect. So the Confucius Institutes came into a reasonably warm reception, and now a lot of them are being shut down. It used to be that Chinese scholars and students from across the board were warmly welcomed in the US. Now they're being suspected of being spies, in some cases legitimately, in many cases not so. But basically there is this attitude toward China as a rival and a sneaky rule-breaking rival that I think undercuts the ability to have a lot of these mechanisms of trying to influence politics and policy work. And you're seeing it in our current campaign. Nobody wants to sound moderate on China, right? It's a question of, do you go full Tom Cotton, or do you go to the sort of evolving position of Joe Biden? That is a spectrum which is much, much more critical and suspicious of China than you would have seen 10 years ago or even 5 years ago.
All right, Jacques, thanks for that excellent presentation, and thanks to Matthew and Michael as well. I'm going to turn it back over to Raleigh Flynn now, who will take us home.
Thank you.
Thanks. First of all, thanks for a great series, and thanks to Jacques, Michael, and Matthew for today's presentation. I thought this was just terrific. For those of you who missed some of the series or would like to watch it again, the videos are online. Go to the FPRI YouTube channel. Also, for those of you who are new to FPRI, please check out our website. There's just a huge amount of interesting information, articles, podcasts, etc. online. Thank you again to all of you who've supported us and are our members. If you're not, once again, consider joining us. And as I've mentioned before, for a $50 increase in your membership, you can get access to Orbis, an Orbis subscription. So thank you again, and I wish you well. May your families remain safe, yourselves and your families, and have a wonderful weekend.